You are listening to the Information Security and OSINT Podcast, Episode 17, originally released on July 24th, 2020. My name is Josh Amishav. This week we have Matthias Wilson on the show. Matthias is an open source intelligence investigator as well as a member of the OSINT Curious project, and just a really fascinating person doing some great research. Hopefully he'll share some war stories with us today. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense, the data breach monitoring platform. What's the easiest way hackers break into your network? By using valid usernames and passwords. Hackers collect millions of leaked credentials from almost daily data breaches. Without visibility into which of your employees' or users' credentials have been leaked, it's tough to protect against this. Integrate BreachSense's powerful yet easy-to-use API into your existing security solutions to prevent account takeover and stop online fraud. Matthias, welcome to the show.
Hey Josh, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Thanks. Want to get started with how did you get into OSINT?
OSINT is something that I've been doing for basically ever since I had access to the internet. To be honest, it really started out when I was in school and I had to write essays on certain books, and I was too lazy to write them myself. So I would look up Usenet groups, and every once in a while, and this is like 95, 96, 97, I would find something that I could use in school. And my natural curiosity about things, just blossomed when I was able to go online and find all this information. And that was kind of the starting point. And later on, I moved into military intelligence. And of course, that was also great to me being a curious person, get a lot of information that you couldn't easily find. But I always noticed that whatever I did in military intelligence, there was also a certain amount of information that was still out there that we hadn't looked at. So next to my normal job, I would always, go home, look online, what is happening in a certain area that I was working on. And when social media kind of evolved, you would find a lot more information on individuals, but just news in real time. And that's kind of the short version of how I started in school, being curious and trying to cheat, basically. And then just, moved on throughout my career and constantly, whatever job I had, just tried to find additional extra information that was out there on the web.
Cool. Okay, so one of the things that sparked this interview was you tweeted about it was a Nigerian prince scam that was sent to you. Can you tell us about that?
So everything that I do, I kind of try to combine with OSINT. And of course, we all know the Nigerian princes and the advanced payment scams and things like this. And we get these in our inboxes every once in a while. And I remember watching a TED Talk of a British comedian named James Veitch, who actually answered and just, interacted with the scammer for quite a while. It was really hilarious. And one day I thought, hey, why not try this myself? So I did that, and it had a comical element to it because of the information that we sent back and forth. But at the same time, what I wanted to do is really figure out where these people were located, who is the group that is behind this? Is it even an organized group? So just the whole intelligence aspect of this. So it started out me just answering, and of course you have to have a persona that you've built up. So I don't go out with my real name. And the persona that I choose was actually our former interior minister. And the reason I did this is because I found a nice picture online of him holding his ID card, because I knew at some point in the scam, this is going to happen. They're going to ask for an ID card. So I had a fairly lifelike image of an ID card. I took that guy's name, I built a persona around it, and I just, went back and forth with the scammers, getting more information on them. And next to the things that we transmitted, the information that went back and forth between us, so them telling me how I have to pay, me telling them I don't know how that works, and this going back and forth for a long period of time. Then I actually tried to get more information, some more or less from more background information. So I would look into things like what time were the emails sent from those scammers, so I can get a pattern of life. When do they get up? When do they start working? When do they go to bed? And in one of the cases I came to the conclusion that they must be roughly in the same time zone. So of course, somewhere in Africa based on the English that they used, somewhere in the same time zone that allowed me to narrow it down to certain locations, certain countries. What I would also do is I would look into the email IP addresses if I had them, because of course not every provider provides the email address of origin. But sometimes I got lucky and I would get email addresses belonging to a South African mobile provider. So they would send these emails through a Huawei router, a South African mobile provider, So that fit to Africa, that fit to the time zone, and that's just all the intelligence work in the background. And from there on, it was really hard to kind of continue without interacting with them on a different level. So I had to take this outside of the OSINT world, outside of email and internet communications, and get on the phone with these guys. And that was actually the best part ever. Just trying to act as an old German man that doesn't speak English, and converse with some dude in South Africa. And I just tried to push it as far as I can get. So we were at the point that my alter ego had actually transferred money. At least they thought that, because I forged like payment receipts and stuff like that. Just really bad forgery, really bad. But since they were doing the same thing with the documents they produced, they didn't even notice. So they were fully convinced that they'd get like 25,000 euros. And the way the story kind of ended is that I called the scammer again after one of the payments was allegedly made. And I posed as an Interpol agent, telling the scammer, you know what, you're in trouble because you're part of a terror financing scheme. You just received 25,000 euros, and we know this is going to go to Boko Haram or some other terrorist organization. And the guy really freaked out. I mean, he was really scared. I recorded a lot of this, so it's quite interesting if you listen to this and read this on my blog. And what he actually asked was kind of a proof of life, more or less, of the other alter ego I had. So I would switch roles on the phone, from the Interpol agent to the old German man who was just arrested and was crying because he had been arrested and he didn't know why. And of course, after a certain period of time, they would catch on to this and they would know they were being fooled. But it was just a hell of a ride and a lot of fun. And some of these projects, they go for weeks. So I'm working on one right now. We've been going back and forth for, I think, 3 or 4 weeks now. And I think sometime today I have to send out a fake payment receipt for MoneyGram. So some guy in Lagos, Nigeria is going to go to a MoneyGram office hoping to get $750. And there's not going to be anything there. So I'm going to drag this out and have him go over there a couple times. That keeps him healthy. And that's kind of the whole idea. So just a very comical situation combined with intelligence collection to try to figure out how much information can you get on these individuals. What I did in the recent scam that I'm working on is also started using email trackers just to see when they open the email, what IP address they open it from, and also very interesting what system settings they had. So I could see a lot of these guys are running Windows XP and Firefox 11 and stuff like that. So probably just some public calling office, in this case in Lagos, where they have really old computers and they're actually using this to go out. And the idea for the future would be to see if all these people that kind of contact my burner email addresses, if they're somehow related, if I see similarities in the technology used, in the IP addresses used, and maybe to find that there's a larger network, which I assume. But that's kind of the whole idea. So one of my side projects, which is a lot of fun.
That's fascinating. So in terms of the actual, like, to drill down to get more information, I assume you're looking at the SMTP headers, okay, and then possibly using something like canary tokens or other tools to be able to access their IPs. Our IP addresses, and I know you've logged about this in terms of tracking down mobile phones. How accurate are you able to get with taking out an IP address from the SMTP headers?
Basically not at all. You have to be really lucky. So in a lot of cases, if they're using a webmail service like Gmail or something like that, the last traceable IP you will get is some Google server somewhere. It's like that with a lot of the webmail services. If they do go through a client-based email program, so they're running Thunderbird or something like that, then you might get lucky and you will get a local IP. In most cases that I saw, it was actually from a cellular provider. And this is the biggest problem, that basically you only know that they are in that cellular provider's network in some way. You can't even really say if they're in that country, because, for example, my provider, if I'm roaming in a different country, I'll still have a German IP address that my phone goes out through. So that was also another side project, which I've been working on the past 2 or 3 weeks to figure out how accurate are these IP addresses, because there are lots of providers out there. Free providers, paid providers that would give you geolocational data on IP addresses. And from what I've been doing, and keep in mind, this is not scientific at all. This is just me traveling around and trying different things out. I find the accuracy, at least in Central Europe, to be very, very bad. So in a lot of cases, I'm hundreds and hundreds of kilometers off target, basically. If I'm in a foreign country, my IP address still says I am in Germany. So it's not really reliable. So in case of these scammers, to actually make that statement that the person is in South Africa or Nigeria or something like that, then again, I go back to the pattern of life analysis. When do they log on? When do they log off? What English do they use? Is there a lot of times they would use a pretext, so a pre-formulated email to answer. But sometimes with the further you go on in these projects, they'll just start writing freehand, basically. And based on the English or the pidgin English they use, you might be able to narrow that down to specific regions. Now, I don't have that knowledge when it comes to pidgin English and the different or the differences in the African countries. But then I would just reach out on Twitter or some people I know and just ask, hey, is this something specific for a certain region? What does this word mean? Because they also have complete different vocabulary. So it's a whole intel process that doesn't rely on one source of information, in this case, an IP address and a geolocation to that, but just a lot more to kind of drill down where someone will possibly be. And I say possibly because at the end of the day, you never really know. I mean, it could be I'm looking at a Nigerian that is using a Nigerian cellular provider, but actually sitting in Europe. So you will never know that unless you have other collection means, which I don't have anymore and maybe I've had in the past. But there is always a point where you can't go any further. And then that's why you always use the words of estimate probability.
Okay. In terms of the Canary tokens, what tools are you? Canary.io, or is there other tools that you recommend?
So to be honest, a lot of the stuff that I do, I don't rely on one specific tool. So I would just do OSINT, conduct OSINT. So I would Google something and just see what comes up and maybe test that in that moment. At the moment, I think I'm using a site called Get Notify. I think that's what it's called, but I'm not really sure because for me, it's one of the things that I have in my tool set, and I don't use that often other than this Nigerian prince case because in my normal investigations, it might be unethical, it might be unlawful. So this interaction on this level with a target is something that I wouldn't usually do in a case. So it's just for the scammers. But I think Get Notify should be that specific page for Canary tokens.
Okay, could we drill down a bit about what you mentioned that geolocation for IP addresses are inaccurate? So I know you blogged about I think it was a train trip that you took to various locations, and then you were looking on the cell data to see which antenna you were connected to. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so there was this huge thing on Twitter about a certain journalist stating that he geolocated someone based on IP addresses, and I looked into that and it didn't make sense to me. So I wanted to figure out how accurate is this information, how accurate are IP addresses, and I just it wasn't a train. I took my car and I drove through Germany, and I tried to figure out how my cell phone acts in the different networks. So I have a SIGINT background. So to me, the whole cellular part was pretty easy. I know my way around that, and just to show people how accurate it could be, I showed them which cellular cell I was in, how you can use openly available platforms such as Cell Mapper, Wiggle, or something like that to actually trace back a cell to a location. And at the same time, looking at the cellular data, I also looked at the IP addresses my phone had during that complete journey. So basically started out at home connected to my Wi-Fi. And at home connected to my Wi-Fi, I got an IP address where a lot of also the paid providers said, oh yeah, you're somewhere near Munich. Well, yeah, of course, I am somewhere near Munich. That's where I live. Then I switched on my 4G, and the IP address that was then allocated to my phone also said, hey, you're somewhere near Munich, which was true in that moment. And so I drove roughly 150 kilometers away from Munich. And the cells, of course, changed because I was constantly moving and I was connecting from one cell tower to the next cell tower to the next one. But the IP address didn't change. So 150 kilometers away, my provider still had allocated that IP address, which, according to a lot of paid services, said I was somewhere within 50 kilometers of Munich. So that was kind of the first finding, at least for Germany, because keep in mind this might be different in other countries, that the IP geolocational data there was not very accurate. Another thing is also that this IP address that had been allocated to me by my provider is also something that hundreds or thousands of people might be using in that moment as well. Because IP, especially cellular providers, they massively use IP sharing. So that was, very interesting. And just to see that again, I mean, we read about it, we know it, but just to try this out yourself was great for me. And then I stopped at McDonald's, and I went into that McDonald's and I hooked up to their public Wi-Fi. And their public Wi-Fi put me 500 kilometers away, because apparently all the McDonald's in Germany, they use a big provider for their public hotspots. And all of the traffic channeled by that big public provider is basically in one or two servers that it goes out through. So one IP address, 500 kilometers away. So within 1 hour, I couldn't have been more inaccurate when it came to all the IP addresses I had. And since this was close to the Austrian border, I thought, hey, let's just check what happens if I go to a foreign country and my phone is roaming. So I was in Austria with my phone. Of course, I had Austrian cells because that's what was serving my phone at the moment, but I was still using a German IP address. And this doesn't really matter if I go to Italy, to Austria, to the US, or whatever. I will, with at least that provider I used in that moment, I will always be going out through a German IP address. So again, if you have information like this, in some cases you might not even be able to make a geolocation for a country, let alone a region, or further drill that down. One thing that I noticed is I assume, but I haven't tested this yet, when I am roaming with my phone, that my provider has an extra IP address range for roaming. So that might be something, if you know that specific IP address range, if someone is outside of the country and is roaming, and you get that you can at least state, okay, this person is not in country. So that's also something that I want to look into in the future. Yeah.
Okay, so the takeaway from this, if I understand correctly, is you can't trust the IP address. You're going to have to use other metadata, like the times, like your example of what time people are sending emails, the language that they use. Are there other, I would call them metadata, that you suggest that we could use to figure out where somebody might be?
When it comes to cellular networks, not really that much. Again, it is the pattern of life of someone. So if you know this person has a phone that he uses for social media, and then you just, based on the time that this person is active, you might be able to figure that out. When it comes to IP addresses, it's really challenging, so you can't take that alone. There used to be possibilities for a so-called HLR lookup. So in theory, you would try to send that phone a short message, and the provider would tell you where that short message has to be routed to. So in the home network or a roaming network. That's kind of the whole idea of an HLR lookup. It costs like 1 or 2 cents, and you could do that commercially. But those possibilities have gone down in the past couple of years. So instead of actually getting the country where the person is roaming, or a smaller region, which would have been possible maybe 10 years ago, now you might just get the information the phone is roaming, so it is in another country. But then again, sometimes you get the time zone back. So I did this with a friend. I knew he had a US phone. He was in Japan. I looked him up with this technique, and it just said he's out of country, but the time zone it sent back for this information was like Japanese Pacific time. So that kind of made sense. But at the end of the day, it's not just Japan in that time zone. There are also other countries, so you can't really drill it down. So I think the most important thing when it comes to investigations in any sphere is actually to just collect as much information as you have, or you can, to try to correlate this information and see how it makes sense. Know that you will have certain limits, you'll have certain boundaries, and then based on all that information, try to make your assessment. And if you don't have enough information, then it might be really hard to make a rock solid assessment. So that's why you have to be very careful with the wording you use.
Okay. I want to also, you had another blog post about some social engineering you did there was a building that you posed as a professor. So we're talking about when there's not enough online information, what can you do to further your investigation?
So again, if you can't find anything online, and this happens quite often in Germany because we are not as advanced when it comes to modern technology, to social media and things like that than other countries. Germans just don't like it for some reason. They're very aware of their data privacy. So in a lot of cases, you won't find information. And on a previous job I had the possibility to actually go out and conduct some research in person. So this could have been just observing a certain site and trying to figure out what is going on there. And in some cases, if it was really relevant and the overall threat model that we created allowed it, we would actually engage in social engineering. So in one case, I was working on it was a large due diligence case. We were looking into a specific company. We found that that company was based in Munich, and we really wanted to know, is this just a front company, is a shell company, or is there really something behind it? Do they have an office? Do they actually run business there? So I stopped by there. I had a look because Google Street View doesn't help in Germany. The last images are from 2009. If I'm looking for something in 2018, things might have changed, especially in larger cities. So the first step was to just go by and have a look. And then I noticed that I could not get into this house. It was an old villa in the middle of the city. It was gated, no possibility to get inside. And then after sitting down with the team and discussing this and what are the dangers that could happen if we try to get into this building, and we came to the conclusion, we'll just try, and we'll basically do a social engineering attack. And this, again, social engineering requires a lot of reconnaissance, a lot of preparation, which could be done with OSINT. So I started looking into the building itself, because the option of me posing as someone delivering a parcel or something like that, I thought that was too risky. So I wanted to find another way inside. And luckily, this was some kind of historic building by some historic architect, one of his first buildings that he had created. So I'm like, maybe I can use this as leverage to get inside. So I came up with the cover story that I was an architecture professor working on this specific style of architecture, historism, is what it's called in German, and just lurk around the building, take pictures, in plain sight, and then just hope that someone would approach me and ask what I'm doing. And then I would come with that cover story and say, hey, I'm this professor, this is part of my class, I'd like to get detailed pictures. And I read a lot about this style of architecture. So like the next 3 days after that, I knew a lot about that type of architecture. I forgot everything now, but that actually worked, because soon after a guy came up and was like, hey, what are you doing? And I told him my story, and he was so happy because it turned out that the architect was actually his great-great-grandfather or something like that. The house still belonged to the family, and he was so excited that his house, his great-great-grandfather's house, would be part of a university lesson. So he let me in. I was allowed to walk around everywhere. I was allowed to get inside the house. So I basically had free access, except to the office rooms. But in that case, I didn't need it, because what I found inside the house is that I did not only have one name on the mailbox inside the house belonging to the company I was researching. I found 30 or 40 additional names that were not on the mailbox outside. So, them sharing the same mailbox, you would assume that they have some kind of connection. And that enabled further OSINT research, and we could basically draw the lines between those individual companies with that information we had. So another important point is, for me, it's always the intelligence cycle. It never really stops, right? You have like the planning process, you have the collection process, you have the reporting process, and then the evaluation process. And after the evaluation, you might just go back again and start the whole process again. And that's what happened here. I started with OSINT, did all the planning and collecting. Then I went to social engineering, found something that I could use again, and put that into the whole OSINT cycle again. So that's also, something very important to kind of keep in mind, that you can use different intelligence types to leverage each other and to be a starting point for a complete new cycle.
That's a great story. All right. Do you have any contrarian views in OSINT, and what are they and why?
Yeah, I do. So I personally think that we had a golden age of digital OSINT, because people were on social media, they were out there with their real names, they were sharing their lives. So especially when it came to investigating individuals, we were very lucky the past couple of years to find a lot about these people. Now there are a lot of developments that are countering that. So we have more data privacy at the moment. We have GDPR, we have the Californian law, which is going to be passed. We have many things worldwide where people are just, really aware of their data privacy. Companies have to abide to certain rules and regulations, so not put that much out there. And of course, that means that we will find less and less information online. At the same time, you see a shift of how people communicate. It's not people on Facebook anymore just shouting out everything they're doing and constantly posting food pics and whatever under their real name. If I look at my daughter, she's using a pseudonym on TikTok or a closed Instagram account. So more or less closed social media that you can't access as an external user. You have to be part of that network, which again would require some type of social engineering or human or whatever to get inside. And then if you see how things are evolving, a lot of the services out there, if it's a newspaper, if it's a certain app, they're now allowing you to register with your Apple ID. But they don't get the information on you or your email address or anything. They just get this anonymous Apple ID. So it might be even harder in the future to find that a person is using a certain service because they logged on using the Apple ID system. And I think maybe not now, but in 2, 3, or 4 years, we will have a lot less real-time data on individuals that we can find. We'll still find a lot of stuff from their old life on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. But the question is that actually actionable intelligence for a current case if you're looking into something that is 10, 15 years old? So yeah, that's kind of my controversial opinion on OSINT. And I don't think that Internet of Things and IoT and all this stuff that's coming out there is actionable intelligence when it comes to investigating individuals. Like I mentioned before when we were discussing before the podcast, I don't care if someone opens his fridge 20 times a day if I'm working on a due diligence case. That might not necessarily help me further the case there.
So the Register published a story this week about 7 VPN providers who claim they were not logging user information, actually logged details and stored the logs on OpenS3 buckets. So barring misconfigured servers, how will OSINT investigators find the types of data they can currently find online today?
So we're going to continue to have data breaches all the time. This might be a very good source of information, but again, it depends on what you're investigating. So if you're investigating a person and his or her activities in real life, a lot of the stuff you might look into now are images, pictures of them. So if you have a data breach, and yes, you'll get an email address, you'll get maybe account information and things like that, but you might be missing this real link to real life. It is useful, definitely. And another thing that you have to consider when talking about breach data is the ethical or legal standpoint. Because I know in a lot of countries and a lot of people that I've worked with in the past and that I'm in contact with, for example, they're not allowed to use breach data. Even if it is openly available, for example, on Have I Been Pawned or your company or something like that, they might not be able to use that for ethical or for legal reasons. So I see a lot more of that happening, of course, because there are a lot more services out there, and a lot of companies are very naive when it comes to securing their access and their hardware. But the question is if we are allowed to use it in the future and what benefit will we have. So again, for my specific field, more or less researching individuals and what do they do, getting a real dossier of this person can be useful as a starting point for other investigations. So knowing, oh, they use that platform, maybe I can find something on the platform, but maybe not so useful when it comes to seeing what they actually do in daily life, as with every intel source. That's why, for me, one of the most important things is not really to rely on one source, on one tool, but just to kind of know what's out there in general. And depending on the case you're working on, just, open the drawer and pull something out of that drawer of your tools and your sources that will be useful for that case.
That's great advice. And it sounds like based on what you said, human and social engineering is going to become a much more critical skill in order to be able to infiltrate the closed groups where possible.
Definitely, if you are allowed to do so, if you have the legal rights, and if you don't have the ethical issues in doing so. And so a lot of corporate research, for example, will stop there. Even the government research, and sometimes that's just something you have to keep in mind.
Great. All right. This is great. Where could people interested, where could they follow you? How can they get in touch with you?
So I am on Twitter MW-OSINT. That's where you can find me. I also have a blog, keyfindings.blog, where every once in a while I try to write an interesting story about Nigerian princes or other things I do. And another good source for OSINT in specific, and something I'm also part of, is the OSINT Curious project, where you can find everything about OSINT tips, tricks, methodology, different tools you can use in blogs, videos, and stuff like that. And that would be on osintcurio.us.
Yes, and I can second that. OSINT Curious, the podcast, the YouTube channel is great. It's a great source of information. So thank you for putting that out. All right, well, that's it for today. If you have any feedback or questions for me, then contact me at podcast@breachsense.io. And if you got value from this episode, then please share it with a friend. See y'all next week.